Right, good morning, everybody. A little bit about myself first. I guess I'm, by training, a statistician, an epidemiologist, so I'm coming at this very much as a researcher of consensus development methods rather than a practitioner. I do get involved in developing clinical guidelines, but again, very much as a statistician, epidemiologist, a methodologist, rather than for having any clinical input, for example. So that's where I'm coming from. And I guess my other interest in this is because I like doing research on patients, on populations, but I also like doing research on the people I work with, on clinicians, on the so-called experts that take part in guideline development, for example. So I'm going to pose two questions. First one is asking about whether we should use formal consensus development methods, and the second is more about how different approaches to consensus development and their use might actually lead to different outcomes from guideline development. I don't want to get your hopes up. I'm not going to finish with the answer to these questions, but hopefully in about 15-20 minutes' time you'll be a little bit more enlightened about using consensus development methods, what they are, and the evidence base that may or may not support their use. It's quite bright up here, but do a quick show of hands. How many people here have, as part of guideline development, either running them or taking part in them, actually used formal consensus development methods such as Delphi, NGT, or other methods? So I'd say that's not that many. So leave your hands up for the time being. So how many of you that have used them, keep your hand up if you think by using them you've actually ended up with better guidelines at the end of the process? More hands went up than went down there. So that's very reassuring. I'm not sure that the evidence necessarily exists to support that. We'll come to that later. So why do we want to use consensus development methods in the first place? Well, there are 5 basic reasons why we might want to use them. The basic underlying principles of using these methods. The first is about decision-making processes. There is safety in numbers. Do we get better decisions when multiple people working as groups make those decisions rather than leaving it to one individual? Second one relates to authority. So who is it that's actually coming up with the methods, with the guidance, the recommendations that come out of these processes? Do you trust them? Can you rely on them? Third principle is rationality. And really it makes common sense that by discussing all the possible issues relating to perhaps a recommendation you may or may not wish to make, you can come up with a better way of making that recommendation, what that recommendation ought to be. But perhaps the 2 most important ones in relation to the use of consensus methods are, fourthly, it's a controlled process. So it's a very structured process in the way that questions are perhaps developed and they are discussed, and how individuals taking part in developing guidelines express their views on particular questions. And finally, it can add scientific credibility. It's about the replicability of processes. With most guidelines, you only get one chance at developing that guideline. What you would like to have some assurance of is that if you were to repeat that process you went through in developing a guideline, you would come up with pretty much the same guideline that you did the first time round. So these are our underlying principles. Now, this is GIN's statement on the expectations that guideline developers should have when putting together their guidelines, particularly in relation to decision-making process and consensus. So read these out. So consensus is required to interpret the evidence, to translate that evidence into recommendations and determine and handle situations where evidence is lacking to answer those important clinical questions. And it doesn't come out to say, yes, you should or shouldn't use these processes, but certainly there is an idea that they may help deal with perhaps some of the more controversial areas where perhaps more credibility is needed to ensure that people can have trust in the process that led to particular recommendations, particular guidance. Which slide am I on? Oh, sorry, it's the right one. So, for those of you that haven't used consensus methods before, and I guess it's about 3/4 of you, so slightly more than I was expecting, there are, I guess, 3 basic approaches. So the principles of formal consensus development is that it's about a process that allows the generation of questions, the elicitation of views on those questions, which is done in private, and then some process of feedback and potentially discussion around those questions, followed by more ratings or elicitation of judgments. The key features are that those judgments are elicited in private. It's about trying to avoid some of the pitfalls that can happen during group decision-making processes. The sort of things where maybe one person is dominating a conversation or leading it in a particular direction. So the aim of consensus development methods is to try and avoid that by having structured approaches to discussion and structured approaches to finding out your views on particular issues and structured approaches to bringing together all those individual views to represent group views. So perhaps the first classic way of doing this is called the Delphi approach. And this is an approach where it's conducted remotely. It's usually conducted by post, by mail. And it might start with questionnaires being mailed out with a series of questions which you may be asked to rate. They may be yes/no answers. They may be about prioritization. Which do you think are the most important, least important issues? It may be about, do you think that this is an appropriate intervention to use in this type of patient? Those sorts of questions, you would be rating those on your own in private. All those questionnaires will be submitted. There'll be a process of bringing together all the results, which would then be redistributed to all of those people taking part. You'd then have an opportunity to see what particular comments came out, what everyone else's ratings were. You don't know who made them, but you'll know typically, well, this was the average rating from the group, this was the distribution, some people said this, a few people said that, but overall, this is the breadth of views of the group, and then you'd have an opportunity to re-rate, revise your own opinions in the light of that form of feedback. And again, this process can go on, but a key feature is that you don't meet. You do this largely in private on your own. An alternative approach is the nominal group technique, where you do meet. Very much a similar process. You make private judgments on your own. These are fed back to the group, but alongside that, there's a structured discussion within the group, going through perhaps all the items you have in developing your guideline. Then you have an opportunity to revise your opinions in private. And again, this process can be iterative. It may not be one meeting, it may be multiple meetings, multiple rounds of rating and revisions. A commonly used method is the modified Delphi, which is developed by the RAND and UCLA for the appropriateness or necessity of particular interventions, for example, usually on different indications of patients. And this is a combination of both approaches. It's got the initial mailed questionnaires that you would get from Adelphi, but in this case, the groups actually meet to discuss and then revise their opinions in private. And there's a whole set of formal processes for how you would present the findings, structure the scales, present the feedback of, well, what would constitute an appropriate intervention, an inappropriate intervention, or one where it's uncertain whether it is or isn't appropriate. So those are the three classic approaches. I'm not going to talk about other, sometimes referred to as formal methods like consensus development conferences, because typically those don't involve the private elicitation of views, which personally I believe is a core principle of formal consensus development methods. Anyway, to answer the first question, I thought, well, how would I approach this if I was developing guidance? And I'd come at it as trying to define what my question might be. And my question is about, well, are formal consensus developments more appropriate than less formal or informal approaches? And, well, I thought, well, my population would be, well, guidelines, guideline development. We could open this up to national guidelines, specialty society guidelines, perhaps almost all guidelines beyond very localized guidance, I think we could include. For my intervention, I'm thinking, well, we could have formal consensus methods. For my control group, got a bit stuck here as to, well, how would you define what isn't the use of formal consensus development methods, because it's potentially a whole breadth of other approaches. But in the end, it didn't really matter. Likewise, for my outcome, I thought, well, the quality of the guideline would be a good outcome, but I'll gloss over the slight problem of how we would ever measure that. And then the final criterion was I wanted good quality evidence. I want randomized controlled trials of guideline development. I don't want you just to have one group developing guidance. I want you to have multiple groups developing the same guidance. Then we can formally provide that good quality evidence for whether consensus developments work or they don't. The reality is that evidence doesn't exist. We're never really going to be able to do that. I'm not sure any of you developing guidelines would be quite happy to run 20 parallel guideline development processes at the same time. It's bad enough, hard enough, just running one of those. So moving on to my second question is, well, what do we know about the evidence on the use of formal consensus development methods? And there are three broad areas where we've looked at what matters. The first is group composition. So who takes part in developing guidelines? The second is, do the different types of approach matter? Which consensus development methods produce what type of differences? And then finally, when we use the same methods, how much difference do we get when we look at the final recommendations of guideline development groups? So broadly, when we look at group composition, then what the evidence shows is that single specialty groups of doers tend to produce evidence which favours the interventions that they do, hardly surprising. Groups from different countries tend to differ in their judgments, but in no consistent way. So were you struggling to hear me before? I have a habit of moving around a bit, I'm afraid. And finally, that groups from different settings, for example, selecting groups from different hospitals to each generate their own guidance, again produces different results, but there's no consistent pattern in what you would say other than they just produce different guidance. So the key finding from that is you're much better having guideline groups made up of a mix of individuals rather than going for single specialty groups. The second area is different consensus methods. So what do we know from that? So there's some evidence that the groups that have meetings, the nominal group technique and the RAND approach, they tend to, again, produce judgments that are more favourable than male-only groups. Now, I suspect this is because they tend to be able to provide judgments that are either much more in favour of recommending something or going the opposite direction, not recommending something, but on average you tend to recommend things rather than not recommend things. The second is that there is variation between the findings, and depending on the context, the topic of the guideline, agreement can be anything from pretty poor right up to very, very good, or very excellent agreement between panels generating guidance in different ways. And finally, we do find that if you're presented with a systematic review of the evidence, a group does tend to rate those recommendations more consistently with what the evidence shows. When we look at what happens when groups are conducted in exactly the same way, so we use the same methods, give them the same topic, use the same processes, then we generally find reasonably good agreement between those groups. But it's not perfect. You will find that some groups recommend some things, some groups recommend other things. So have I got about 5 minutes left? So I'm going to quickly run through a study that I was involved in, which was an analysis of 8 different guideline development groups. Well, they weren't really developing guidelines, but we were asking them to make recommendations for using 4 different interventions to treat patients with 3 conditions. So the 4 interventions were cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy, or antidepressants. The conditions were chronic back pain, irritable bowel syndrome, or chronic fatigue syndrome. And half the groups were made up of general practitioners only, because you're asking them to make guidance about recommendations for primary care, and half the groups included a mix of professions, including also mental health professionals. Half the groups were Delphi. They did the whole process by post. Half the groups met and were able to discuss the recommendations of those treatments during a structured meeting. And what we did is to get them to rate the appropriateness of these interventions in these conditions, and this is what the results show. So I'm going to have to talk you through this, and I promised I would avoid including any p-values, any confidence intervals, too many numbers in it, but what this shows is that across the top we have the 4 interventions. Down the side we have the 3 disease groups that were being rated, and what we did was to plot the results for the 8 groups. So in each set of 8 dots, those are the 8 groups. The ones at the top are the NGT groups that met. The 4 lower ones are the Delphi groups that did it by post. And on the whole, there was little change. So the movement between an open dot and a black dot is how the views of the group changed between their initial rating of the appropriateness of the intervention and their final rating having been through the consensus process. So on the whole, little movement, apart from, and if you look at in the 12 sets of 8 dots, it's the 3rd column along and the top group in the set of 8. So for both chronic back pain and irritable bowel syndrome, one of the nominal group technique groups actually did change their views quite considerably. And in one case, in irritable bowel syndrome, so third column along, second row down, they actually shifted their views of the evidence so that rather than agreeing with what the systematic review evidence said of no evidence of benefit, we're not certain, actually shifted their views to one of we actually believe that this is an appropriate intervention. So overall, what did this study show? Well, it showed that within group agreement, so how much people within the same group agree, you get better agreement in a nominal group technique approach. So if you meet, you're more likely to agree with the people on the same group as you. We also found that that agreement improved in all groups during the process. So the process of feeding back the results and, in some cases, meeting actually brought the group closer together. What we found when we compared the results of the different groups, though, is that the agreement of the results produced by the different groups, when they were Delphi groups, they were quite close together. When they were the nominal groups, actually they deviated more. So they differed more at the outset, and then after meeting, that's when they deviated even more. And that would be an example of what's happening there with the group that deviated on the dynamic therapy intervention, where one group suddenly shifted far more than any of the other groups. So it does appear that where you're meeting, there is the potential to deviate quite considerably in your opinions. Now, whether that's a good thing or not, it's hard to tell, but certainly it does mean that different groups will produce different results. So coming back to the underlying principles, on most of the guideline development you'll be doing already does them. You have mixed groups, you have the authorities, you have the rationality, you are discussing things. The key questions are, would using a more controlled process, perhaps using formal consensus development, lead to better guidance? And would it add to the scientific credibility of the outcome of guideline development? So, sorry I don't have an answer to your question, but I guess the conclusions are that the type of approach you do use to formal consensus does have the potential to change the views of the group. Hopefully this is a good thing, but what we don't know is whether it's actually shifted in the right direction or not. Might you have ended up with someone who's perhaps pushed their own view more and led the group astray? Or is it that you've had someone who's brought something new to the table and has actually convinced the rest of the group that that is the best interpretation of the evidence and the appropriate recommendations that you should be making from it? Is that my time now?
Thank you very much.
I shall finish now, thank you.